He was just an old man on a morning walk, until 5 words stopped a cop cold. "I trained your SWAT captain." What started as a routine harassment turned into a reckoning decades in the making. A forgotten name, a buried legacy, a truth too powerful to stay silent. This isn't just a confrontation, it's a storm of justice that refuses to be erased. What follows is a gripping revelation of legacy, betrayal, and a buried past that forces an entire department to reckon with its roots. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hadn't yet lifted fully over Willow Creek Park, but the world was already golden. The dew clung to blades of grass like it refused to let the night go. Birds stitched quiet patterns across the sky, and the hum of the world waking up held a sacred kind of peace. Elijah Carter walked those winding trails like a man retracing sacred ground. For 30 years, the park had been his cathedral. He moved slowly now, a soft limp in his left knee, the relic of a life spent in boots and bracing through storms both overseas and right here on American streets. At 73, Elijah wasn't just a man of routine. He was the quiet heartbeat of a neighborhood that changed its skin every decade but somehow always knew his face. Each morning, the same. A gray hoodie zipped to the neck, a steel walking cane in his right hand, and a folded newspaper under his arm. He greeted the Robins before he ever passed a person. The regulars knew him. He had helped some of them in ways they hadn't realized until they grew older themselves. "Morning, Mr. Carter," a jogger called softly from a distance. He nodded, the motion slow and deliberate. His presence was gentle but solid, like an oak tree that had seen too much wind to fear the next storm. But this morning, something was off. It started with the cruiser parked diagonally across the far side lot, engine humming even though the officer inside wasn't going anywhere. Elijah noticed it in passing. No hazard lights, no urgency, just watching. A few feet deeper into the park, near the old fountain, he spotted the second cruiser. Another idle posture, no activity, just presence. Elijah had lived long enough to understand how presence could speak louder than action. He continued walking, refusing to let suspicion steal the ritual of his morning peace. But a knot had begun to tighten in his gut. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent. He'd learned to listen to that knot. It had kept him alive more than once. By the time he reached the bench near the duck pond, he saw him, Officer Blake Harrison. New. You could tell by the shine on his boots, the way his uniform clung stiff and proud. He stood like a man trying to look older than he was, jaw squared too tightly, scanning the park like it owed him answers. Elijah took him in, unflinching. The young man's eyes flicked toward him for a second too long. Then back. Then again. Something coiled. Blake had graduated from the academy just 4 months earlier. He had the top scores in tactical training and a record free of any disciplinary marks. But those numbers never spoke to what really mattered. The gap between protocol and prejudice, between authority and wisdom. That gap could never be closed by a badge. Blake had been briefed, of course. The park was a known gathering place for elderly residents and early morning joggers. Low risk, no real incidents on record. But there'd also been warnings, vague notes about suspicious activity, and loiterers, always coded in the language departments used to shield bias behind bureaucracy. And when Blake saw the old man slow-moving, hoodie-draped, dark-skinned, he didn't see Elijah Carter. He saw a profile that matched 100 internal bulletins. Elijah knew what this was before a word was spoken. He had felt this same gaze at 19, stepping off a bus in Birmingham. At 30, walking into a bank in his Navy uniform. At 55, showing his veteran's card at a hardware store, and still being asked if it was real. It wasn't always the words, it was the scanning, the sizing up, the doubt buried under politeness. And now, this version, uniformed, young, unsure of his own power, but willing to test it. Elijah reached the bench, lowered himself slowly, and opened his newspaper. He read the same headline 3 times, but absorbed none of it. The knot in his gut had grown tight. Across the path, Blake whispered into his radio, one hand grazing the butt of his sidearm. Elijah didn't look up, but he could feel the tension growing like humidity in the air. 3 patrol cars, 1 elderly man. He wondered if this would be the morning he stopped being a routine and became a report. He heard the footsteps first, deliberate, rhythmic, approaching. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. He had nothing to hide and everything to lose. Blake stood directly in front of him now, the sun behind his shoulder, casting his face into shadow. "This area is off limits before 9 a.m., he said, voice firm. Elijah blinked slowly, raising his eyes without lifting his chin. "It's 8:53, he replied. Blake hesitated. Just a beat. Enough for Elijah to see that he hadn't expected a calm response. The training manual hadn't prepared him for calm. Blake adjusted his stance. "I need you to vacate the premises immediately, sir." The word "sir" cracked at the edge, forced. Elijah studied him now. The boy had a fresh scar on his temple, like he'd scraped through a lesson he didn't want to remember. His hands twitched slightly, betraying nerves behind the front. "You new to this area?" Elijah asked, not out of challenge but curiosity. Blake ignored the question. "You're trespassing on public property that isn't open yet. I'm asking you again." Elijah closed his newspaper gently. His hand rested on his cane. He didn't stand, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I trained your SWAT captain." The silence hit like a dropped stone. Blake blinked. The sun shifted slightly, enough for the light to hit Elijah's face, full now, his deeply lined skin, the glint of something resolute in his eyes. Not defiance, not arrogance. Just truth. "What?" Blake said, lower now. Elijah tapped the edge of his cane against the bench once. "Darnell Hughes. That's your captain, isn't he?" Blake stiffened. He didn't respond. "I taught him everything he knows about negotiation, about restraint, about not escalating a situation just because your ego can't sit still," Elijah said evenly. Blake's mouth opened, then closed again. He stepped back slightly, not out of fear but disorientation. Elijah watched the boy, saw him shifting through everything he'd been told, everything he thought he knew. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Hughes was a respected figure, hard, disciplined, black and known to keep his past guarded. I need to confirm that," Blake said finally, reaching for his radio. Elijah nodded once. "You do that." Blake turned slightly, fingers hovering over his earpiece. His lips moved, whispering something into the comms line. A pause, then a reply that made his entire posture change. He looked down at Elijah again, longer this time. Not the gaze of suspicion. Something like fear, or recognition. Elijah didn't move. He didn't need to. He had just flipped the entire power dynamic without leaving the bench. And still beneath the tension, the sun, the names, the unease lingered. Elijah knew systems didn't change just because truth was spoken aloud. He'd learned long ago that history didn't surrender easily. He watched Blake step away slowly, voice now lower as he spoke into the radio again. But Elijah felt it. The shift. The old rules, rippling under the weight of a name not meant to be remembered. He leaned back gently, the wind brushing past his ear like a whisper of something coming. Then, from behind him, a second voice, sharper than the first.
"Hey, you there, get out of the park!"
Elijah turned, heart skipping once. It wasn't Blake this time. It was another officer. This one unfamiliar, older, voice laced with urgency and something colder. And he had his hand on his weapon. Officer Blake Harrison's fingers hovered near the holster on his hip as he scanned the scene again. His throat tightened, jaw clenched. He heard the second officer bark the command, "Get out of the park," but it only deepened the unease spiraling through him. Elijah Carter hadn't moved, hadn't flinched. That calmness, that terrified Blake more than any raised voice ever could. He was trained to recognize threats, but nothing in the academy had prepared him for what he felt standing in front of this man. Not fear, not even anger. It was something stranger, something like being exposed. Blake had always been told to trust your instinct. It was printed across locker room posters at the precinct, stitched into morning briefings. What they really meant, trust what you've been conditioned to see. And what Blake saw when Elijah first appeared, moving slowly across the park's damp paths, was a silhouette that had been drilled into his subconscious since cadet training. Black, male, hooded, alone, standing still where people should be moving. That was the mental math, suspicion, action. He hadn't looked for a reason to talk to Elijah. He'd looked for permission to assert control. Even now, with Elijah seated and composed, Blake felt cornered. But not by the older man, by the unraveling of his own assumptions. He stepped forward again, hands still near his weapon, not drawn but suggested. "You've been asked to vacate the area," he said, trying to sound resolute. But his voice cracked, barely. Elijah met his gaze with the ease of someone who had been there 1,000 times before, on the receiving end of disbelief, masquerading as duty. "Why?" Elijah asked simply. Blake opened his mouth but paused. The script in his head faltered. He wasn't supposed to be questioned. "This section of the park isn't open to the public yet. It's posted." Elijah turned slightly, scanning the area. "There are no signs." "There don't need to be. It's departmental policy." Blake's words sounded weaker the more they stacked. The truth was, There were no clear policies for parks like this. Just informal orders, filtered down through back-channel whispers. Watch the benches near the fountain. Loiterers mostly. Keep an eye out for anyone who doesn't look like they're exercising. And everyone knew what doesn't look like meant. Blake had heard it his first week on duty from a training officer. If they're standing still too long, especially if they're alone, and just check it out. That said more than the whole sentence. He repeated the line now, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if studying him not for what he said, but for what he wouldn't say. Blake took a breath. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not in front of the other officers watching from their cruisers. Not after the last evaluation, where he was told he needed to show more command presence. "I'm going to need you to leave the premises now," Blake said, his tone firmer, more practiced. Elijah didn't move. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, slowly, visibly, and pulled out a creased photograph. He unfolded it carefully and held it up, just long enough for Blake to see. It was an old training group photo. Maybe 20 men. Most wore tactical gear. Some smiled, others looked exhausted. One man, dead center, stood with arms crossed, strong, proud, unmistakably in charge. It was Elijah. Blake's eyes flicked from the photo to the man in front of him. The same eyes, the same chin, the same quiet gravity. But before he could process it, another voice triggered a memory in Elijah. A memory sharpened by time, one he'd carried like a bruise under the skin. Selma, 1965. He was 13. His mother had told him to stay away from the march, but Elijah had followed the drums anyway. The sound drew him like thunder pulling water from clouds. He hadn't even made it to the bridge before he saw the blue helmets and batons, saw the way the officers stood, shoulders puffed, eyes dead, saw how one grabbed an older man by the collar and slammed him against a car door for nothing more than looking him in the eye. And when Elijah had turned to run, he tripped, fell face first into the gravel. A boot pressed into his back, pinning him like he wasn't a child, like he wasn't anything. "You don't belong here," the officer had growled, not yelled, just said it like a fact. Those words had never left him. And now here they were again. Different voice, same message. "You don't belong here." The phrase echoed again through the years, bouncing from one uniform to another, slipping into the mouth of each new face that thought the badge made them the border patrol of black existence. Elijah didn't speak. Not yet. He wanted the silence to say what words never could. He wanted Blake to feel the weight of his presence, not as a threat but as proof. Proof that this country kept trying to erase men like him, only to find their names still breathing decades later. Blake stepped forward, and again, his hand grazed the holster. Not quite a threat, but not a comfort either. "Sir, I won't ask you again," he said. Something inside Elijah shifted, a sadness so old it felt like muscle memory. He stood, slowly. His knees groaned, but his back remained straight. He folded the photo and slipped it back into his pocket. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand anything. He simply said, "I trained your SWAT captain." Blake froze. It was like someone had turned off the world for a second. The air between them thickened. His eyes darted from Elijah's face to the badge on his own chest, as if checking to make sure it still meant something. What did you just say?" Blake stammered. Elijah stepped a little closer, still calm. "Captain Darnell Hughes. I trained him. Years ago, before he became your superior, before he ever wore that badge." The words hit Blake like a slap he couldn't admit hurt. He knew that name. Everyone did. Hughes was one of the few black men in the upper ranks. Feared, respected, known for his no-nonsense leadership, and impossibly private about his past. "You're lying," Blake said, but even as he said it, his voice trembled. "I don't need to lie," Elijah replied. "I don't have to prove anything, but maybe you should ask him who taught him to walk into danger without drawing a weapon first." The confidence in Elijah's tone wasn't arrogance. It was earned, worn like armor. And in that moment, Blake saw something he hadn't seen before. Not a man. A reckoning. A collision between generations, one raised on resistance, the other on reaction, one built from marches and scars, the other from screens and assumptions. Behind Blake, the second officer approached, hand still tight on his holster. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, eyes on Elijah. Blake didn't respond. He was staring at Elijah now, not just seeing him, but recognizing him for the first time. And just as he opened his mouth to say something, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 4, stand down. Do not engage. Subject identified. Stand down." Both officers froze. The command was clear, cold, final. Blake turned to the other officer, whose face had gone pale. Without a word, he slowly removed his hand from his weapon. Elijah watched it all in silence. The moment didn't feel like a victory. It felt like exposure. Not just of Blake, but of a system that had tried to bury him, only to be caught holding the shovel. Then, a soft vibration in Blake's earpiece. Another message. His eyes widened. His hand fell to his side. He looked back at Elijah, voice lower now, almost reverent. "Wait, you're Elijah Carter?" Elijah nodded once. Quiet. Blake took a full step back, his face stricken. "What the hell?" he whispered. But before he could ask more, a third cruiser pulled up, its lights off, unmarked. The door opened, and out stepped a tall figure in plainclothes. Captain Darnell Hughes. Blake Harrison stood frozen, the heat of the morning suddenly lost in the cold weight of Elijah's words. "I trained your SWAT captain." The name that followed, Captain Darnell Hughes, was one Blake knew like scripture. In the academy, Hughes was the ghost that haunted every corridor. The instructors told stories about him like myth, a living legend of tactical brilliance and controlled ferocity. Hughes was the embodiment of command presence, sharp, methodical, and utterly impenetrable. Blake had only seen him twice, once during a precinct-wide address, and once when Hughes quietly pulled a sergeant off a rising internal racism scandal without saying a word to the press. He didn't talk much, but when he moved, things happened. And now, this man, this elderly black man with a walking cane and a paper-folded photo, had just claimed to be the architect behind Hughes's legend. Blake blinked, hard, as if doing so would erase the moment, reset the narrative, but the weight of Elijah's presence remained, unmoved by disbelief. Behind him, the other officer muttered something under his breath, his voice edged with discomfort, but Blake didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was a spiral now, part procedural, part personal. Who was Elijah Carter? He stepped back once, not in retreat, but in reset. Instinctively, his hand lifted to his radio.
"Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need verification on a civilian name. Elijah Carter. Caucasian male standing by. A mistake."
Elijah raised an eyebrow, subtly. Blake's stomach twisted. He hadn't even realized what he'd said until the words landed. Caucasian. He hadn't meant it. Or maybe he had. Maybe somewhere inside, in the reflexes he thought were clean, the prejudice was hiding, assuming legitimacy belonged to whiteness. He corrected himself quickly. Correction. Black male, late 70s, believed to have military affiliation, claims association with Captain Hughes. Unit 4. Stand down immediately. The response came faster than expected. A quiet click, a pause, and then another voice, calmer, firmer, cut in next. Blake's eyes widened. The voice wasn't dispatch. It was command. "Repeat. Do not engage. Subject confirmed. All units hold perimeter." Blake lowered the radio slowly. Every protocol inside him was screaming for clarity, for instruction, for permission to understand what he was now a part of. Elijah didn't gloat, didn't speak. He simply stood there, every inch of his bearing saying what words never could. You had no idea who you were speaking to. The other officer stepped away now, mumbling something about checking with HQ. His presence deflated entirely. Then, from behind them, footsteps. Deliberate, steady. Blake turned, and there he was. Captain Darnell Hughes. No uniform, just a plain dark jacket, jeans, and that same steeled expression Blake remembered from the precinct. Elijah saw him too, but didn't flinch. Darnell stopped a few feet away, his eyes sharp and weary, locked onto Elijah's. "Elijah," he said. Elijah nodded once. "Darnell." It wasn't a greeting. It was reverence. Blake watched the exchange like someone realizing they'd stumbled into the wrong room of history. Darnell stepped forward and extended his hand, not as an officer, as a man reclaiming part of his story. They shook. Blake opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Darnell turned to him. "You radioed in a code 87. Blake nodded slowly. He was in a restricted... Blake swallowed hard. He felt 20 years younger, stripped of all his academy polish. "I didn't know who he was." "No, he wasn't," Darnell said. "And even if he was, that man has more right to stand here than any of us." Blake swallowed hard. He felt 20 years younger, stripped of all his academy polish. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," Darnell replied, voice even. "None of you do." He looked back at Elijah, and for a moment something cracked through his carefully guarded exterior. "Regret. You came back," he said. "I never left," Elijah replied. And that was the truth. Elijah had never left the community, never disappeared from the city he once helped train to defend. But the institution had left him, quietly, systematically, until his name was nothing more than a whispered footnote in the shadows of files buried beneath bureaucracy. Back in 1987, after a decorated 22-year military career, including time as a Navy SEAL and a tactical negotiation instructor, Elijah had returned home with the intent to reform local policing. He'd proposed a revolutionary non-lethal intervention strategy. He'd built drills around de-escalation. He'd trained more than 40 officers, including Darnell Hughes, back when Hughes was just a rookie with a chip on his shoulder and too much silence in his eyes. But Elijah's presence unsettled the wrong people. He was too sharp, too articulate, too black. The department never fired him. They just made him invisible. They canceled briefings without notice, shifted his name off memos, ignored his promotion nominations, and when budget cuts hit, his position was the first eliminated. Restructuring, they called it. Darnell had tried to intervene, but he was young, outranked, powerless. And Elijah? He walked out with his head high and never spoke of it again. Until today. Blake stood in stunned silence as the truth unfurled around him. He felt small, not just because he had misjudged Elijah, but because something deeper had ruptured inside him. The rules he thought he understood were just stage lights. The real story had been hiding behind the curtain the whole time. I didn't know, Blake said quietly, unsure who he was apologizing to. You didn't ask, Elijah replied. You never do. Darnell exhaled slowly. We need to talk. To you, Elijah asked. No, Darnell said. To them. He nodded toward the other cruisers, toward the officers still watching, the dispatchers still listening, the entire network that had labeled a 73-year-old man a threat until a name made them hesitate. Elijah's jaw tightened. You ready for that? I wasn't, Darnell admitted, for a long time. But I've watched them rewrite you, erase you, and I stayed quiet. That ends now. Blake couldn't breathe properly. Everything he had built, his training, his instincts, his quiet pride in his badge, suddenly felt like scaffolding on a crumbling house. Elijah, Blake started. I didn't mean to. I know what you meant. Elijah cut in. I've heard it my whole life. Policy, procedure, instinct. But all of those sound the same when they're used to erase men like me. Blake looked at the ground. His radio clicked again. All units clear the area. Civilian interaction no longer active. Resume standard patrol. The command was antiseptic, stripped of emotion. Elijah turned to Darnell. They're still trying to control the narrative. Darnell nodded once. Not for long. Blake felt like he was falling through layers of himself. His voice, small now. Is everything I learned wrong? Elijah studied him, not with pity, but with clarity. No, just incomplete. A silence settled between them. Then Blake did something unexpected. He removed his badge, held it in his palm, looked at it like it was a puzzle piece he no longer trusted to fit. What would you have done if I hadn't stopped? If I had escalated? Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked past Blake, toward the fountain, the morning light catching the water in fragments. Then I would have done what I was trained to do. Elijah said softly. I would have let you bury me, and trusted that the truth would rise anyway. And in that moment, Blake understood. This wasn't just a man. This was a mirror. And the reflection was everything the system didn't want to see. But before anyone could speak again, Blake's radio crackled with urgency. Unit 4, confirm location immediately. Suspicious package reported near Willow Creek Community Center. Possible threat. The three men turned in unison. Darnell's face hardened. Elijah's jaw tightened. And Blake? He already knew this wasn't coincidence. Elijah Carter had become a problem. Not because he'd broken a law. Not because he'd raised his voice, lifted a hand, or stepped beyond a line. No, Elijah became a problem because he existed. Because his presence dragged ghosts out of closets that the department had nailed shut decades ago. Because one name, his, spoken at the wrong time to the wrong officer, had begun to crack the glass on a perfectly polished image. Inside the upper floors of the 14th Precinct headquarters, the quiet hum of the day's business had shifted into hushed murmurs and closed-door meetings. The building, clad in marble and guarded pride, had always managed to project control, but today, it buzzed with anxiety. Captain Darnell Hughes had barely made it through the lobby before a lieutenant from Internal Review pulled him aside. You didn't clear the park response through command, she said, voice lowered, clipped. You diverted a unit mid-duty. Darnell looked her dead in the eyes. I responded to a miscalculated threat report. That's within my right. Not if it involves a suspended name. He stiffened. Excuse me? The lieutenant leaned in slightly, almost whispering. You know what I mean. Carter's name is flagged. Legacy status, internal discretion only. I don't know how he even showed up on a dispatch channel. Darnell said nothing. He didn't need to. The damage was already done. Not by Elijah, but by the realization that they'd tried to erase him and failed. The lieutenant handed over a folder, thick and wrinkled from too many hands. Inside, old memos, evaluation reports, recommendation letters. Elijah's name scattered throughout, then vanishing altogether by 1990. No termination, no reassignment, just absence. Buried, Darnell asked. She hesitated. Redacted.
That was worse.
In precinct language, redacted didn't just mean removed. It meant intentionally forgotten. It meant they'd taken a man's contribution and folded it into silence because he made them uncomfortable. 30 years ago, Elijah Carter had proposed a radical restructure of how force was used during arrests. He wrote papers on de-escalation tactics that outpaced their time, taught negotiation drills that some officers still practiced, unknowingly under different names. But his ideas had one fatal flaw in the eyes of the department. He was black. And not just quietly black, the kind they could parade on recruitment brochures. Elijah was outspoken, critical, public. Worse, he had influence. He'd trained some of the best, he was shaping the culture, and in a department built on hierarchy and whiteness dressed as tradition, that made him dangerous. One by one, his recommendations stopped being accepted. His presence at strategy meetings was overlooked. His requests for funding were stalled. Rumors were floated about insubordination that never made it to paper but lingered like smoke. Then one day, his name was gone from the directory. No press release, no retirement ceremony. He was just gone. Darnell had been too young then to understand the mechanics, but he remembered the shift, the silence that fell over the department any time Elijah's name was mentioned. The way senior officers redirected conversations, said things like, "Let's move on," and more insidiously, he was too much for his own good. And Darnell had learned to stay quiet, because he saw what happened to black men who made too much noise. But now, Elijah had made himself visible again, not with a protest, not with a demand, with his presence alone. And it scared them. Inside the chief's office, a different meeting was unfolding. 3 senior commanders sat in a semicircle, reviewing the field report. Officer Blake Harrison's name came up twice, once for the initial confrontation, and once for the code alert that triggered the higher response. "This can't get out," one of the commanders said. His voice was low but firm. "Too late," another replied. "There's already chatter. Civilian bystanders. A few phones were recording before units arrived." The chief closed the file slowly, hands pressed together. "Then we stay ahead of it, control the narrative." "How?" asked the third commander. "If Hughes goes public, and the press finds out Elijah Carter trained half of our original SWAT protocol, they'll start digging. And when they find out we wiped his name..." "They won't," the chief snapped. "We buried it deep. If it surfaces, we discredit it. Say his ideas were tested but flawed. Say he left voluntarily." A silence hung thick in the room. It wasn't justice they were trying to preserve. It was optics. Because justice would have meant acknowledging Elijah's contributions decades ago. Optics? Optics demanded clean lines, uncomplicated heroes, and a department that always looked like it had done the right thing, even when it hadn't. Downstairs, Blake sat at his desk, still stunned. The words still rang in his head. "I trained your SWAT captain." He had replayed every moment from the park over and over, each time seeing the shift in Elijah's expression, the quiet dignity, the subtle ache behind his words. Blake had joined the force to make a difference, or at least that's what he'd told himself. But in truth, he'd joined for clarity, for order, for the feeling of certainty in a world that often didn't make sense. But today had unraveled all of that. He opened his laptop and searched the department archive. No results. He tried again. Elijah Carter, SWAT trainer, Navy background. Nothing. He typed in Darnell Hughes's early career assignments. He found redactions, gaps. It was like someone had taken a scalpel to the past. Blake stood, walked to the internal record office, and requested access to old training logs. "I'm sorry, Officer Harrison. Those files are sealed," the clerk said. "Why?" "Legacy classification. Clearance required." "Whose legacy?" The clerk said nothing. That was the moment Blake realized he wasn't being denied access because of protocol. He was being denied access because of protection. Someone didn't want Elijah's story seen. Across town, Elijah sat in his modest living room. Photos lined the mantel. None recent, none decorated with awards. Just family. A daughter estranged by time. A wife buried too young. A grandson he hadn't seen in 3 years. He looked out the window toward the street. A black sedan idled half a block away. He noticed, didn't flinch. He remembered what it felt like to be watched, measured, sized up by a system that smiled with one side of its mouth while pressing a knee with the other. His phone buzzed. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. "They're talking about you. Internal Affairs is in session. They're scared. Be ready." No name, just the words. Elijah set the phone down slowly. A strange calm settled over him. He didn't ask for this moment, but it had come, and he was ready. Back in the precinct, Internal Affairs met in silence. They reviewed the footage from the park, enhanced it, slowed it down. Elijah's calm voice echoed across the room. "I trained your SWAT captain." Someone paused the video. Another investigator whispered, "Why wasn't he listed in any of our legacy records?" Someone else replied, "Because someone made sure he never was." The lead investigator, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes, turned to the group. "Open a quiet review," she said. "No press, no interdepartment notice yet, but start digging. Every record, every deleted file. I want to know why Elijah Carter disappeared." Her assistant looked up concerned. "What if we find something big?" She didn't blink. "Then we deal with it." She clicked a pen. The meeting ended. The quiet review had begun, but nothing about what was coming would stay quiet for long. Officer Maya Coleman wasn't supposed to be in the archive room that day. She'd only been with the department for 3 years, long enough to know how the building breathed, when to speak, and when to disappear into silence. She had learned quickly that asking too many questions got you polite smiles in public and suspicion behind closed doors. But something about the name Elijah Carter refused to leave her mind. It had surfaced twice in 24 hours. First, during a whispered conversation between 2 senior officers in the break room. An almost panicked tone laced in the phrase, "He said he trained Hughes. Can you believe that?" Then again, through her terminal login. She had typed in tactical training models, legacy instructors, researching curriculum materials for a community engagement presentation, and the name popped up briefly, Elijah Carter. But the link redirected to a dead page. Access denied. She couldn't shake it. It was like trying to ignore a haunting. Now in the dim flicker of the records room, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant shuffle of someone pushing a cart of files down the hallway, Maya typed the name again into the legacy archives. Elijah Carter, instructor, years active 1986-1990. Then, a second line flickered. Content classified, restricted access, internal use only. Her fingers hovered. Maya's uncle, a former officer himself, had once told her, "If you ever see internal use only tied to a black name in that building, it doesn't mean private, it means buried." She accessed the secondary system, not the department's mainframe, but an old dusty server that only a few knew how to navigate. The interface looked ancient, clunky, like someone built it on a forgotten budget and never cared to update it. It was there she found it. A hidden subdirectory, Carter. Carter.tactical models, archived 1990. She clicked. The screen jumped, then flickered. And then a video loaded. It was grainy, black and white footage, time-stamped June 14th. Elijah stood in a training yard, flanked by 20 officers in full gear. The caption, Advanced Hostage Negotiation Drill, Scenario Alpha. The audio kicked in seconds later. "Remember," Elijah said, his voice crisp, commanding, "your weapon is your last resort. Your first is your mind. Your second is your voice. If you have to draw before you've spoken, you've already lost." Maya leaned in, mesmerized. The footage rolled through a simulated standoff, an armed suspect in a warehouse with a hostage. Officers began to fan out, tension in their body language. One leaned toward a weapon. "Freeze," Elijah commanded. Not at the suspect, but at the officer. "Holster. Speak." She watched as Elijah stepped forward, unarmed, his voice clear and firm. "No one dies today," he said in the drill. "If we walk out with a corpse, we didn't resolve, we just survived." Maya's eyes welled unexpectedly. It wasn't just the power in Elijah's delivery. It was the reaction of the trainees. They were locked in, focused, absorbing his every word like scripture. Another video loaded. This time, tactical communication model, civilian crowd control. She watched as Elijah led a room of officers through de-escalation drills that prioritized eye contact, calm tone modulation, and non-threatening body language. These were techniques she'd only seen outlined in updated manuals, labeled under different names, attributed to more recent officers. But here it was, clear as daylight. Elijah had developed them first. She checked the video tags. Instructor credit, unknown. She frowned, clicked again. Each file had the same issue. Elijah's face was there, his voice, his strategies, but every formal tag unlisted, every author line blank. Every department memo that followed described the techniques as department-led innovation, never naming the man who pioneered them. And then it hit her. They hadn't just forgotten Elijah. They'd stolen him. His ideas, his models, his legacy. They took the heart of his work, polished it, and repackaged it under names that were easier to digest, names that didn't make white officers uncomfortable. She recognized one tactic listed under the Fowler method, taught to her in the academy, with no mention that it had come from a man who'd been all but erased. Maya felt her chest tighten. She thought of her own training, how the instructors had lectured on proper restraint, like it had descended from the heavens, when in truth, it had come from a man like Elijah, scarred, experienced, careful, and forgotten. She dug deeper. Memos, internal reviews. One in particular stood out. Concerns regarding Carter's influence on new recruits, recommendation to reduce exposure in curriculum. Dated 1989, signed off by a deputy chief. The language was coded, but clear. Elijah Carter's approach emphasizes subject empathy over assertive authority. This methodology, while theoretically effective, may contradict necessary command presence expected from uniformed officers. Recommendation: gradually phase out field leadership involvement and pivot training attribution to general department development. In simpler terms, he made us look too human. Maya scrolled further, her fingers trembling. There it was, a line buried in a 1990 personnel summary. Carter, E. Position dissolved in departmental restructuring. Future contract engagement not recommended. No misconduct, no failure, just swept out with the trash while his teachings were laminated and passed around like badges of enlightenment. She closed her eyes. Her father had warned her, don't go looking for truth in that place unless you're prepared to carry it. She opened them again. One final file. Legacy Group Photo, SWAT Certification Ceremony, 1989. The image loaded slowly, a wide-angle shot of 30 men, most of them young, in full tactical gear, beaming with pride. In the center, Elijah, standing tall, arms crossed, medals visible on his chest. And next to him, a younger Darnell Hughes, head tilted slightly toward his mentor, barely 24, full of hope. Maya stared at the image, her fingers shaking as she clicked print. The printer in the corner whirred to life, cutting through the silence. She grabbed the photo as it slid out, still warm. The hallway outside the archive room was quiet, but something had shifted in her gut. She didn't know what she would do with the photo yet, but she knew one thing. They had tried to erase a man who had built the very foundation they walked on. And she had proof. As she stepped out into the hallway, she almost collided with Sergeant Tomlin, a longtime conservative officer known for his sharp tongue and cleaner-than-thou uniform. He looked at her hand, looked at the photo. "What's that?" he asked casually. Maya hesitated. "Department history." Tomlin leaned in slightly, and for a second something unreadable flickered across his face. "Be careful where you take that," he said, voice like gravel. "Some stories ain't meant to be found." Maya locked eyes with him. "And some stories are too important to stay buried." He didn't respond, just turned and walked away. She stood still, heart pounding, fingers clenched around the photo. A new voice rang out over the intercom, breaking the tension. "All officers report to briefing room 2. Internal affairs update in 10. Maya turned toward the sound. Something was unfolding, and she had just stepped into its center. Captain Darnell Hughes sat alone in his office, the overhead light casting a low amber hue across the awards on his shelves. His fingers traced the rim of a ceramic mug he didn't intend to drink from. The precinct was quieter now, late evening, shift change, but inside Darnell, a storm brewed. He couldn't stop seeing Elijah's face. That same unshakable stillness, the unwavering eyes, the calm that carried weight not just from age but from knowing. And that line, "I never left," it had cut deeper than anything he'd heard in years. He closed his eyes, and was suddenly 24 again. Darnell crouched behind a makeshift barrier, sweat pouring down his face, fingers trembling as he held a simulation rifle. Across the open field, a staged hostage screamed. Smoke from flash grenades blurred the targets. He had panicked. Moved too fast. Got the hostage killed. The instructor stormed in, yelling, berating, until a larger voice sliced through the noise like a cleaver through glass. "Elijah," someone whispered. He stepped forward. No armor, no weapon, just that stone-faced calm. He crouched beside Darnell. "You moved before you listened," Elijah said, quiet but firm. "I thought I had to take control," Darnell mumbled, ashamed. "No," Elijah said. "You have to take responsibility. Control's easy. Real leadership's about restraint." That moment rewired something inside Darnell. It was the first time he'd seen a black man not just hold power but command it, own it, embody it. Not by volume, but by gravity. He'd followed Elijah like a shadow for months after that. Learned not just tactics, but how to exist in a system that wasn't built for him. Elijah taught him how to carry himself so well no one could call him a threat without revealing their bias. He taught him to leave no errors, no gaps, no weakness that could be turned into justification. "Perfection isn't fair," Elijah had said once, "but it's the cost of being seen." And then without warning, Elijah was gone. No one said his name. The training models remained, but his signature was scrubbed. It was like watching a man turned into a ghost in real time. Darnell had stayed quiet. Now he hated himself for it. The knock on his office door broke the memory. Lieutenant Walsh stepped in, holding a manila folder. "IA is pressing," he said. "They've seen the footage. The files Maya pulled. They want you in front of the board by end of week." Darnell didn't move. "And Elijah?" Walsh shrugged. "Still off record. Technically a civilian. No charges, no action against him." Darnell nodded. "Then I'll talk to him." Walsh's brows tightened. "You sure that's smart?" Darnell's voice dropped. "It's necessary." But before he could leave, his department-issued phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text appeared. "You let them erase him. Now you're trying to manage him. Bad idea." He stared at the message. It wasn't signed, but he knew exactly what it meant. Word was spreading. Elijah wasn't just a man anymore. He was a fault line. Later that evening, in a private conference room at City Hall, Darnell sat across from Deputy Mayor Lenora Price and Police Commissioner James Monroe. Both wore the same tight expressions, somewhere between panic and pretense. "We can't have this story blow wide," Monroe began. "I know," Darnell said. "We've kept this department's record relatively clean for the last decade," Price added. "No major PR disasters. If Elijah Carter becomes a headline, we lose control." "Then we give him a seat," Darnell said. Price blinked. "Excuse me?" "A conversation. Private. Direct. We offer a formal apology, maybe a commendation. Something off camera. Show respect but keep it internal." Monroe leaned back. "And what if he refuses?" Darnell paused. "He won't." He wasn't sure if he believed that, but it was the only move that made sense. Price sighed. "Fine, but this doesn't leave the building. Keep media out. No statements, no press." Darnell stood. "I'll extend the invite." As he left the room, the whispers started again. Down the hall, near the elevators, among aides and advisors who had all read the same quiet memos. Elijah Carter, wasn't he removed for cause? No, they phased him out, gently. Why now? Why's he resurfacing? Darnell heard every word, and didn't answer a single one. Elijah stood on his front porch when Darnell arrived. The night air carried the scent of damp grass and the hum of cicadas. "Captain," Elijah said, his voice like gravel and steel. "Not tonight," Darnell replied, "just Darnell." They sat outside, two men in the same silence, but for very different reasons. After a long pause, Darnell said, "They want to make things right." Elijah turned to him, eyes narrowed. "Do they?" "They want to meet, privately. Formal apology, recognition, maybe a plaque." Elijah's chuckle was dry, bitter. "A plaque." Darnell looked down. "It's not enough, I know, but it's a start." "No," Elijah said, "it's not." Darnell met his gaze. "What do you want, Elijah?" "I want truth," Elijah said. "I want names. I want accountability. I want them to stand in front of cameras and admit what they did, and then I want them to say my name." "That's not how these things work," Darnell replied, tension rising in his voice. "Then change how it works," Elijah snapped, eyes flashing now. A silence fell, thick and unforgiving. "You were the one who told me to be perfect," Darnell said quietly, "to stay clean so they had nothing to use." "And you did," Elijah said. "You rose. But at what cost?" Darnell felt it then, that hollow ache in his chest, he'd ignored for years. The knowledge that in his rise he'd stepped over the very man who cleared his path. "I want to fix it," he said. "Then don't ask me to disappear again," Elijah replied. Darnell nodded slowly. "They'll fight you. I'm ready. You'll be attacked. I've survived worse." Darnell stood. The air felt heavier now. "I'll relay the message," he said, "but you should know they won't give you a stage without a fight." Elijah stood too. "Then I'll take it." Inside the department the next morning, Monroe reviewed the report from his assistant. Elijah Carter declines private meeting, requests public forum, with press. He crumpled the paper. "Who does he think he is?" Monroe hissed. Price sighed. "A man who knows he's got leverage." Another aide leaned in. "What do we do?" Monroe stood slowly. "We remind him who really runs this city." The clip was only 43 seconds long. No gunfire, no violence, no yelling. Just a quiet exchange in a sunlit park. An elderly black man, cane in hand, calmly facing down two uniformed officers. His voice was low, steady, almost reverent, as he delivered the words that would rupture a city. "I trained your SWAT captain." The footage, captured by a college student walking her dog, was uploaded without a caption, without context, and without warning. By noon, it had over 2 million views. By nightfall, Elijah Carter was trending in 38 cities. The internet did what the institution never intended. It resurrected a man the system had quietly erased. Within hours, journalists scrambled. Who was Elijah Carter? Why had no one heard of him? Why wasn't he in the city's police history records, or SWAT archives, or training directories? The silence around his name only fueled the fire. The more they couldn't find, the more the world wanted to know. In a cramped editorial room at a major online news outlet, a young producer named Lila scrolled through the video again, frame by frame. "Look at the officer's face," she said to her editor. "He's not just surprised, he's ashamed." The editor nodded. "And the older guy? He's calm. He's been through this before." They pulled public military records. They found fragments. An Elijah Carter who served in the Navy. An instructor. A few citations. But then nothing. No retirement story. No follow-up. "People don't just disappear," Lila muttered. That night, the outlet ran the headline, "Who is Elijah Carter, and why did the police try to erase him?" It exploded. Within days, protests began to swell. Not marches, not yet, but digital storms. Twitter threads documenting erased black veterans. TikToks from former officers now speaking in vague, cryptic ways about an old mentor no one talks about anymore. Hashtags, graphics, screenshots of Elijah's image from old training tapes Maya had anonymously leaked to a progressive reporter. He never left. They just stopped looking. Memes turned him into a symbol, a stoic face beneath phrases like "respect before reform," "erase me and I return louder," and "legacy stolen, not lost." Social justice groups picked it up fast. The Urban Defense Initiative called for immediate acknowledgement of Carter's contributions and a formal apology from the city. The Black Officers Coalition launched an internal petition demanding transparency in training record redactions. University students started sit-ins, calling for their campuses to investigate whether any of their law enforcement partnerships had used Carter's models without credit. And the more the department dodged questions, the worse it got. The city's PR team scrambled. Behind closed doors, Monroe, Price, and Darnell sat in a sterile media briefing room, facing a panel of consultants. "We're recommending controlled transparency," the lead strategist said. "A soft acknowledgement. Say the department is reviewing Carter's records. Frame it as part of a larger legacy equity initiative." Price raised an eyebrow. "So, vague empathy." "It's strategic empathy," the consultant corrected. "It gives the appearance of accountability without admitting fault. You preserve authority while giving the public a digestible narrative." Darnell didn't speak. He stared at the table, jaw clenched. The room moved on. Within 24 hours, the department released a statement. "The City of River Park recognizes the public interest surrounding Mr. Elijah Carter. While his contributions to law enforcement are currently under internal review, we are committed to honoring all individuals who have played a part in shaping our training history. We ask the public for patience as we continue to gather facts." The statement wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the truth either. Online, the backlash was immediate. Internal review, cover-up. Why not say his name properly? Give the man his flowers now. Even mainstream media began digging deeper. An op-ed in the New York Times titled "The Disappearing of Elijah Carter" asked, pointedly, how many black legacies had been paved over for the comfort of whitewashed history. On the other side, the backlash also came. sharp and ugly. Conservative news outlets labeled Elijah an agitator and questioned the validity of his credentials. One anchor sneered on live TV, "If this guy was such a hero, where's the official record? I don't buy this redemption tour just because social media wants a new hashtag." Right-wing influencers accused him of race baiting and distracting from real issues. They framed the viral moment as a setup, calling it classic leftist propaganda that endangered good cops just doing their job. Online trolls flooded comment sections with racial slurs disguised as skepticism. Anonymous forums posted blurred images of Elijah's house, guessing at his address. The silence of the department only deepened the danger. Elijah sat at his kitchen table, the lights dim, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. His phone buzzed again. Another journalist. Another request. Another opportunity to explain why he had to watch strangers argue over the legacy he lived. His daughter had called earlier. Her voice trembled. "Dad, you're everywhere. They're saying your name. People finally know." He didn't respond at first. Not because he didn't feel it, but because part of him didn't know how to carry that kind of recognition anymore. He had spent so long making peace with invisibility. Now he was being pulled out of the shadows by strangers demanding justice. Justice that couldn't bring back the years stolen. Still, he knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about every black man who had ever been silenced under the guise of protocol. Every contribution scraped off a report. Every act of brilliance rebranded under a safer name. He stared at the printed photo Maya had brought him, the SWAT graduation, his arm on Darnell's shoulder. They thought erasure was the end. But now, he had become a beginning. He stood slowly and moved toward the front door to retrieve the newspaper. It wasn't there. Instead, something else fluttered slightly in the breeze. A folded sheet of paper, taped to the glass. His fingers froze. He peeled it off. No name, no signature. Just block letters typed out on an old-school typewriter font. "Sit down before you end up underground." Elijah stared at the message, his face unreadable. Then he turned and locked every door in the house. The letter still sat on Elijah's kitchen counter, untouched since the night before. He hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't shown it to anyone. He hadn't even spoken about it. It rested there like a shadow made solid, proof that the past didn't just haunt, it hunted. Outside, the morning sun filtered through half-closed blinds, painting stripes of gold across the floor. The house was too quiet for the world spinning outside its walls. Outside, he was a trending name, a symbol. Inside, he was just a man who hadn't spoken to his daughter in 6 years. He sat down slowly, tea cooling beside him, hands folded as if he were preparing for something heavier than conversation. The doorbell rang. He didn't flinch. Somehow, he already knew who it would be. When he opened the door, she was standing there, denim jacket, hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes sharp and unrelenting.
"Hello, Daddy."
Amira Carter hadn't aged the way time demanded. She had the same fire in her stare that Elijah once saw in her as a teenager, when she stood on a desk in a high school classroom and refused to sit down until the teacher acknowledged the misrepresented history of black figures in the textbook. Now she worked as an organizer for a community justice coalition. Her voice had moved protests. Her writing had torn through academic walls. And her distance from Elijah wasn't spite, it was protest. He stepped aside without a word. She entered slowly, like walking into a museum she didn't want to visit. "Tea's cold," Elijah murmured. "I didn't come for tea." He nodded. "I figured." She sat down across from him. The silence wrapped around them tightly. But it wasn't empty. It was loaded. Years of things unsaid sat between them like furniture too heavy to move. "You're all over the internet," she said. "I noticed. They're saying you trained Hughes." "I did." "They're saying the department erased you." "They did." She leaned back, arms crossed. "And you let them." That landed like a slap. Elijah didn't react outwardly, but his breath caught for just a moment. "You think I had a choice?" he asked. "I think you chose silence," Amira said, voice calm but cutting. "You disappeared into that system like it was family, like it was more important than us." He looked away. "I was trying to survive." "No," she said. "You were trying to fit. Even when they made you invisible, you kept hoping they'd see you. You never came home and said, 'They're erasing me.' You never warned us. You just vanished." Elijah closed his eyes. "You were young. I was 16. Old enough to know something broke. Mama cried every night. And you just said it was work stress. I thought you'd been fired. Then I thought you were sick. Then I thought maybe you just didn't care enough to explain." Her voice cracked then, not from anger, From ache. And then she died, Amira said softly, and you still didn't talk. He rubbed his temples. I didn't know how. You always knew how with them, she said. Your trainees, your recruits, the officers who got your best words. Why not us? He didn't answer. Because the answer hurt. He had spent his life teaching men how to face chaos, but when chaos crept into his own house, he didn't know how to speak. Silence had become his armor, and like all armor, it had kept others out just as much as it protected him. I thought keeping quiet would protect you, he said finally. From the truth? From the burden of it. She shook her head. That wasn't your choice to make. Elijah stood, walked over to the window. The street was still. A neighbor waved from across the lawn. A woman he barely knew, but who now looked at him with a strange mix of reverence and curiosity. That's what his life had become. A museum exhibit. Distant admiration without intimacy. I wasn't strong enough to lose everything and still come home smiling, he said, voice low. So I shut the door before you could see me crumble. Amira stood too. I didn't need you to smile, she said. I just needed you to show up. He turned, eyes glassy. I'm sorry. The apology wasn't grand. It wasn't even enough, but it was real. She stepped closer. So what now? You just let the city rewrite you again? No, Elijah said. This time I won't stay quiet. Her shoulders eased slightly. Good, she said. Because people are listening. They want to know who you really are, and they're not waiting for some press statement to tell them. I'm not sure I know who I am anymore, he admitted. Then tell them anyway. Let them watch you figure it out. Show them what legacy looks like when it refuses to stay buried. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the parts of himself he'd forgotten. The conviction, the clarity, the fire wrapped in grace. You're stronger than I ever was, he said. I had to be, she replied. Another silence. But this one felt like healing, not hiding. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small recorder. Speak, just once, let them hear your voice. He hesitated. I haven't done that in 20 years. And in those 20 years, how much of your story got told by someone else? Elijah stared at the device. I'm not a symbol, he said. No, she replied. You're the truth. His fingers hovered over the recorder. Outside, a car slowed in front of the house. The driver looked through the window, lingered, then moved on. The world was still watching, still judging, still deciding who he was. It was time he answered for himself. He pressed the button. My name is Elijah Carter, he began, voice deep and calm. I served this city for decades. I trained men who now wear medals they never would have earned without the guidance I gave. I taught them not just how to shoot, but how not to. I showed them how to lead without fear. And then I was erased. Amira watched, tears beginning to well. I was erased, he repeated, firmer. Because I was a black man who spoke too clearly, challenged too often, and made people uncomfortable by being excellent. And now, after all this time, they've asked me to be quiet again, to accept a plaque, a photo, a silent nod behind closed doors. He looked up directly at her. But I won't. He stopped the recording. Amira stepped forward. She didn't say a word, just hugged him. It wasn't a reunion built on perfect repair. It was built on truth. And truth, she had learned, was enough for now. They stood like that for a long time. Father and daughter.
Wounded.
Reconnected. And just beginning. That evening, as Amira left the house, Elijah stood at the porch watching her go. The letter was gone from the counter now. Burned. He didn't need reminders of fear. Only reasons for courage. She turned at the sidewalk. One more thing, she called. He raised an eyebrow. You're going to the city council meeting next week, she said. With me. And you're going to read that statement. I'm not a politician. No, she smiled. You're something better. And with that, she walked away. Elijah stepped back inside, his chest tight. Not from anxiety. From purpose. He reached for the recorder again. This time, he wasn't practicing. He was preparing. The council chambers of River Park were never meant to feel like a courtroom. But tonight, under the harsh fluorescence and the weight of 100 eyes, it felt exactly like one. The gallery was packed rows upon rows of folding chairs filled with journalists, activists, city residents, even off-duty officers who came not to defend but to listen. News vans lined the block outside. Reporters stood on tiptoe, camera lights dancing against glass windows. The phrase Elijah Carter was on every tongue, every live feed, every citywide whisper. At the front of the room, a long mahogany desk stretched across the chamber where 7 council members sat. Their nameplates glinted under the lights, but their faces betrayed the tension. Some avoided eye contact with the crowd. Others held neutral expressions like shields. Only one, Councilwoman Brenna Wolfe, sat with her arms crossed, clearly daring the storm to start. When Elijah walked in, the room did not erupt. There were no cheers, no applause. Only silence. It was louder than noise. He moved with slow precision, back straight, eyes forward. Beside him, Amira walked like a lighthouse, poised, protective. She had told him once, years ago, that silence could be its own kind of protest. Now it was his weapon. Mayor Hill stood at the podium, tapping his papers to gather composure. This special session has been called to hear public testimony in response to concerns raised about historical departmental misconduct, specifically regarding Mr. Elijah Carter's contributions to the city's law enforcement training division and his alleged erasure from official record. He paused, then added with evident discomfort, "Mr. Carter has been granted the floor." Elijah stepped up to the mic. He didn't need to clear his throat. The room was already breathless. "My name is Elijah Carter," he said. "Some of you may have seen me recently on your phones, on your television screens. Some of you only just learned I existed, but I've been here, longer than most of you have held your titles." He took a measured breath. "I trained the men you call heroes. I wrote the strategies that saved lives. And I watched those strategies get renamed, repackaged, and handed to others, without credit, without history, without me." He paused. The room was silent. "But this isn't about my name being removed. It's about why it was so easy to remove it." Murmurs rippled across the audience. "I didn't ask for this spotlight," Elijah continued. "But now that it's on me, I need you to see everything." He looked down at the note card in his hand, then tucked it into his pocket. "No script, only memory. I was 15 when a police officer shoved me onto the ground for standing too close to a store window. I hadn't done anything. I wasn't holding anything. But I was black, and that was enough." He looked up. "I joined the military because I thought if I wore the uniform, this country would respect me. But when I came home, they saluted the flag on my shoulder, not the skin underneath it." Elijah's voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed the cracks beneath the surface. "In the 1980s, I joined the department's training division. I introduced non-lethal protocols, crisis negotiation, de-escalation modeling, things now taught to recruits as standard." He motioned toward the press row. "You celebrate it as progress. I lived it as theft." Behind the council desk, Councilman Charles Nestor leaned forward. His fingers tapped nervously against his nameplate. He'd heard whispers, but the reality unfolding before him was sharper than anything he'd prepared for. Elijah's voice dropped. "There are names in your reports that only appear because I shaped them. Men who hold medals for tactics I taught them. Policies that started as my handwriting. My legacy doesn't live in plaques. It lives in silence. In the gap between what was and what should have been." Councilwoman Wolfe uncrossed her arms. She looked visibly shaken. In the crowd, Maya Coleman sat on the edge of her chair, hands clasped. She remembered the grainy video, the printed photo, the look in Elijah's eyes when he first saw himself remembered. Now he stood like a mirror, not just for the city, but for everyone complicit in forgetting. Elijah continued, "I'm not here to ask for your apology. I'm not here to collect your gratitude. I'm here because the people outside this room, those who've been erased like I was, need to know that being silenced doesn't mean being defeated." A quiet sob escaped from someone in the gallery. He looked toward them, not to comfort, but to acknowledge. "I gave this city everything I had," he said, "but the system only took, and when it couldn't take anymore, it threw me out." His hands rested on the podium now, steady. "Not because I failed." His eyes swept the council. "But because I made them uncomfortable." A pause. Then he added softly, "I still do." At that moment, Darnell Hughes stepped into the room from a side door. His presence shifted the air. Several council members straightened. Others looked away. He stood at the back, silent, watching. Elijah glanced toward him, nodded once, then turned back to the mic. "I've come to claim my space, not in your records, not in your halls, but in your memory and in your reckoning." He stepped back. The room did not applaud. It stood. Every single person in the audience rose. Tears on faces. Hands clasped. Journalists scribbled faster. Even Wolfe pressed a tissue to her cheek, discreetly. The silence broke only when one voice, loud, bewildered, rose from the council bench. "Councilman Nestor, why weren't we told about him?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was accusatory. directed not at Elijah, but at the officials beside him. The silence that followed was no longer reverent.
It was indicting.
The ripple effect from Elijah's testimony reached places no press release could ever touch. In precincts across the city, inboxes were suddenly filled with silence, not official statements, not policy briefings, just the weight of what had been said in that chamber. Officers stared at their monitors, some with unease, others with recognition. The walls of the department had always held secrets, but now the paint was peeling, and the stories beneath were beginning to speak. And then the first leak came. An anonymous email sent to a handful of journalists, community leaders, and 2 local council members. No subject line, no signature, just 3 scanned documents, internal promotion recommendations from each named a different black officer as exemplary and qualified for advancement. Each bore handwritten notations in the margins, coded language that barely concealed prejudice. Too assertive, may not be a good cultural fit, lacks polish for public-facing roles. The men had all been passed over. Each promotion went to a white officer with fewer years, fewer commendations, and no record of leadership. The documents were authenticated within hours, and then the whispers turned to roars. The next day, a retired officer named Gregory Hall went live on a podcast streamed by a national justice network. He didn't hide his face, didn't change his voice. He looked directly into the camera and spoke in clipped, steady words. I was told in 1997 that recommending Elijah Carter for commendation would open a door we couldn't close. That's what the chief said, word for word. They knew what Elijah represented, and they were terrified. He didn't stop there. He talked about the training sessions where Elijah's name was scrubbed from materials, about the moment Elijah was pulled from a leadership role and reassigned to logistics support without cause, about how recruits whispered his name like folklore, not because he was absent, but because his absence had become a symbol. Another former officer came forward. Then another. A cascade of truths long kept under the surface began to leak into the light.
No one could stop it now.
Maya Coleman sat on the edge of her desk, phone buzzing nonstop. Since her archive discovery, she had been looped into a network of reform-minded officers, current and retired, who were now mobilizing around Elijah's story. She stared at her screen as a spreadsheet loaded, one she'd received from an anonymous department staffer. It was a 20-year record of training evaluations. The pattern was unmistakable. Black instructors consistently received higher average scores from cadets, but were promoted half as often as their white counterparts. Recommendations attached to their names were repeatedly marked pending review and never followed up on. The document had one more tab, redacted commendations. 32 unawarded honors. 17 of them were tied to black officers who had either resigned or been reassigned quietly within 6 months of their final evaluation. And at the top of the list, Carter. Elijah, 1989. Outstanding tactical innovation. Status not issued. She didn't cry, but her hand trembled as she clicked send. In department hallways once dominated by bravado and silence, conversations now happened in doorways and break rooms. I didn't know, some officers whispered. I did, others admitted, but I didn't think it would matter. Darnell Hughes walked through the precinct like a man on 2 fronts, part leader, part witness. He knew eyes were on him, some respectful, some resentful, but none could deny the air had changed. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about a reckoning that had been earned, not gifted. The commissioner's office tried to contain it. Meetings were held. Strategic adjustments were proposed. A memo circulated promising renewed commitment to equity, but no one believed the words anymore. Because while the department scrambled, Elijah did nothing. No interviews, no rebuttals, no demands, just presence. His silence wasn't retreat. It was power. Every time a new file surfaced, every time a former officer spoke up, the weight of Elijah's testimony grew, not because he chased the spotlight, but because the light had finally caught up to him. At City Hall, Mayor Hill called an emergency meeting. The room was full of tension, but not chaos. They knew this moment would define them. I've seen the documents, he said. I've heard the testimony, and I've made a decision. He turned to the gathered officials, cameras present this time. This city will not sweep Elijah Carter's name under any rug. Not again. Not ever. The room shifted. The people deserve transparency, and those who gave their lives to this department, fully and honestly, deserve to be remembered, not as ghosts, but as architects of justice. He looked directly at the press. I'm calling for the formation of a special commission for historical equity and reform within the River Park Police Department. The words landed like thunder. He continued, it will review decades of training records, promotion decisions, and internal recommendations. It will investigate the extent of systemic bias within our policing structure. One reporter raised a hand. Who will lead the commission? Mayor Hill didn't hesitate. Elijah Carter. The room erupted. Council members gasped. A few clapped. Price looked stunned. Commissioner Monroe's face paled. Elijah, watching the live stream from his living room, didn't smile. He simply leaned back, folded his arms, and whispered, they finally asked the right question. But while the city rallied, not everyone celebrated. In a quiet locked office within the department, a former captain named Lucien Braddock watched the coverage with clenched fists. He had once chaired the internal promotions board that denied Elijah's commendation. He had overseen the redactions, and he still believed it had been the right move. Reckoning, he scoffed to himself. This isn't justice, it's theater. He reached into a drawer, pulled out an old flash drive, unlabeled, and inserted it into his computer. A folder opened. Carter Incident, 1989. Internal notes. The screen flickered. Braddock's eyes narrowed. Then he began typing an email to Commissioner Monroe. Subject, sensitive material Carter. And just like that, the battle behind the curtain began again. Elijah Carter stood in front of a mirror he didn't recognize. He adjusted the collar of a freshly pressed shirt he hadn't worn since his wife's funeral. The fabric felt heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. He stared at his reflection and tried to find the man beneath the headlines. The man before the cameras, the microphones, the cautious applause. He could still hear Amira's voice from that morning. They're going to try to make this neat, pretty. Don't let them. The mayor's office had sent a formal invitation on thick cardstock, bordered in gold. In recognition of your years of service, bravery, and unacknowledged contributions to the city of River Park, we are proud to present Elijah Carter with the Civic Legacy Medal of Honor. A ceremony at the City Performing Arts Center, televised, live-streamed, framed as a celebration of progress. But Elijah knew better. It was theater, a ribbon around a wound that hadn't stopped bleeding. Backstage, the mayor shook his hand like a politician practiced in hugging people he barely knew. We are honored to finally recognize you, Mr. Carter, he said with a thin smile. It's long overdue. Elijah studied him. The same mayor who had called for the special commission. The same man now trying to turn a page before the ink had dried. You think a medal erases a history book? Elijah asked quietly. Mayor Hill cleared his throat. This isn't about erasing. It's about healing. Then why do I feel like I'm being asked to bless the same system that broke me? Before Hill could answer, the curtain rose. Elijah was ushered toward the stage. Applause filled the room. Not thunderous, polite, controlled, safe. The stage glowed with warm light. Behind the podium stood a massive city seal. To the side, a small glass case, empty, awaited the medal that would be handed over in a velvet box. Hill stepped to the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we honor a man whose legacy was nearly lost, whose service went unrecognized. But no longer. He gestured toward Elijah. Mr. Carter, please join me. Elijah moved slowly, with dignity, as if each step were being taken through history. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, but Elijah didn't smile. Not once. He took the small box from the mayor's hands. It was heavier than he expected. Inside, a silver medal, engraved with his name and the words service, strength, legacy. He held it for a moment, and then stepped to the podium. The applause faded. His voice echoed in the chamber. I stand here not because the system worked, but because it didn't. And still, I survived. He paused, letting the words settle. You call this a celebration. But a celebration without accountability is just decoration. This medal does not undo the years I spent being silenced. It does not replace the honor I was denied, the family I drifted from, or the cadets who were taught my words without knowing my name. He glanced at the crowd, and it certainly does not represent justice. The audience was quiet now, frozen. Elijah continued, don't mistake inclusion for progress. Don't mistake a seat at the table for a voice in the room. I am not here to be your symbol. I am not here to complete your narrative of redemption. He lifted the medal, looked at it one last time, then dropped it. The sound of metal hitting wood echoed through the hall. Gasps, Murmurs. A camera shutter clicking. Elijah stepped back from the podium. Not angry. Just done. The fallout was immediate. Every local network ran the footage on loop.
Veteran rejects award on live TV.
Symbol or stunt. Elijah Carter refuses city honor. Online, the moment was hailed as defiant brilliance by some and arrogance by others. The mayor's office went into damage control. We remain proud to have honored Mr. Carter, their statement read, and we respect his decision to express himself. Our work toward equity continues. It was as hollow as it was rehearsed. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't have to. In the days that followed, Elijah did something unexpected. He returned to the academy. Not to teach, to sit. Every afternoon he occupied a quiet bench just outside the drill yard. He watched new recruits run drills he'd designed, shout phrases he'd authored, march lines he had once drawn in chalk. At first they avoided eye contact. Then, slowly, one by one, they approached. Sir, can I ask you something? Did you really help design this drill? I didn't know any of this came from you. And each time Elijah nodded. Sometimes he offered context. Sometimes he just listened. He didn't scold. He showed. He became a living curriculum. One afternoon, a young black cadet named Isaiah sat beside him. You don't remember me, he said, but you knew my uncle, Derek Langston. Elijah turned slowly. Langston. He was solid. Smart. Isaiah nodded. He used to tell me stories about you. Said you taught him more in 1 month than the academy did in a year. I taught him how to see the job for what it could be, Elijah replied. Not what it is. Isaiah looked down. I don't know if I can change anything. Then don't try to change everything, Elijah said. Start by changing the way you do it. Isaiah's eyes misted. They want to pin me into a box. Say I'm too outspoken. Too eager. Elijah smiled for the first time that day. Then you're doing it right. Meanwhile, inside City Hall, the council faced pressure from both sides. Some pushed to reprimand Elijah publicly for disrespecting civic tradition. Others begged him to return and speak at reconciliation forums. He refused both. He wasn't interested in symbolic bridges. He was building doorways. Amira spoke for him once at a student conference. My father doesn't want your spotlight, she told them. He wants your honesty, your discomfort, your willingness to sit with what has been broken, and then build anyway. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Elijah's door. Handwritten. From a woman in Georgia. Her father had served with Elijah in the Navy. He used to tell me about a man who spoke like thunder but walked like mist. The letter read. He said if anyone ever erased his name, that man would find a way to make them remember anyway. Inside the envelope, a faded photo of Elijah and her father side by side in fatigues, laughing. Elijah placed it on his mantle, next to Amira's childhood drawing of him in uniform. He no longer needed the medal. This was enough. Until one morning, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find a courier, holding a sealed document. From the governor's office, you are hereby requested to lead the Independent Commission for Statewide Policing Reform. And beneath that, full authority to investigate, recommend and rewrite training protocol across all law enforcement jurisdictions. He looked up at the courier. Is this real? The man smiled. They say you're the only one they trust. Elijah held the envelope, like it weighed 100 years. Because in a way, it did. It started with an unmarked car, parked 2 blocks from Elijah's house. At first, it came and went, never stayed more than 10 minutes, just long enough for someone to write something down. Snap a few photos. Elijah noticed but said nothing. A black man noticing too much had always been dangerous. But by the end of the week, it wasn't just 1 car. It was 2, then 3, and they stopped pretending. Dark windows. No plates. 1 engine ran all night. Amira was the first to say the word aloud. They're watching you. Elijah didn't flinch. They've been watching me since. But this was different. This wasn't the institutional unease of a city caught in its own guilt. This was targeted. Cold. Personal. The threats returned. This time not on a typed letter but online. Message boards. Anonymous forums. Encrypted chats leaked to a sympathetic journalist. Phrases like the old man will fall, and he doesn't belong in our America. Circulated with images of Elijah's face, sometimes digitally defaced. They called him a traitor, a false hero, a danger to tradition. And beneath it all, a signature kept reappearing. Project Bastion. The FBI picked up on it. One quiet Tuesday morning, Two plainclothes agents knocked on Elijah's door. No sirens, no fanfare. "Mr. Carter, we're initiating a protective detail," one of them said calmly. "I didn't ask for one," Elijah replied. "You didn't have to." They installed surveillance around the perimeter. A black SUV idled nearby most nights. Officers rotated shifts, never in uniform. Quiet presence, soft protection. Amira, despite her protests, moved back in temporarily. "If I'm going to fight for your legacy," she said, "I'm not watching it burn from the sidelines." Word of the threat spread through the community faster than any news segment could contain. But what came next surprised even Elijah. They didn't hide. They organized. Local shop owners began holding free self-defense classes in the back of corner stores. Pastors opened churches at night for community meetings. Retired black veterans formed informal patrols, not to confront but to watch. Mothers walked their children to school in groups. Teens walked their elders home in pairs. It was quiet, careful defiance, the kind Elijah knew all too well. They didn't beg for police attention. They took care of their own. At a town gathering held at the River Park Cultural Center, Amira stood at a podium and read out loud one of the hate messages, then tore it in half. "They think we scare easily," she said. "But what they fail to understand is that we've been scared before, and we survived. We've lived through worse than anonymous cowards in unmarked vans." Applause erupted. No one cheered. They clapped with purpose. Elijah sat in the front row, hands folded. When the applause died down, he rose without prompting. "I don't want you to fight for me," he said. "I want you to fight because you deserve a world where silence isn't safety, where black history isn't rewritten in whispers, where your name isn't forgotten unless you become a hashtag." The room nodded. Some cried. Some just sat very still, listening, knowing. But beneath the organizing, the optimism, the slow healing, something was stirring deeper. In the corners of online forums, on pages hosted through encrypted networks, Elijah's name continued to rise, not as a symbol of resistance, but as a target. Project Bastion was no longer just a tag. It was a plan. The FBI confirmed that a small but well-connected hate group had been tracking Elijah's movements for weeks. They had digital infrastructure, funding, coordinated messaging. What disturbed the agents most wasn't the threats. It was the methodical nature of the surveillance. Time-stamped photos, route maps, schedules, and one phrase repeated in their communications. "He's not just a man, he's a fault line. If he speaks too loud, the whole damn structure shakes." Elijah didn't change his routine. He still visited the academy twice a week. Still met with young recruits who now quoted him like scripture. Still walked the same streets he had marched on in protest years ago. But something in his gait had changed. Not fear, awareness. He began wearing the same military jacket he'd tucked away years ago. Not for show, for memory. "I was trained for storms," he told one recruit. "This one's just modern weather." In one particularly tense moment, Amira returned from a supply run and found a red X chalked onto their front sidewalk. It was gone by nightfall, scrubbed away by a neighbor before Elijah could even see it. But it wasn't the message that scared her. It was the confidence of the sender. The idea that someone got that close and still walked away. She called Darnell Hughes immediately. "This is bigger than we thought." "I know," he said. "And they're not going to stop." Then came the night the air changed. The city was calm, too calm. No threats. No new sightings. No suspicious cars. Elijah sat in his living room, pen in hand, drafting notes for the first commission session scheduled the following week. Amira was upstairs reading. The world was almost quiet. Until the phone rang. It was Maya. Her voice was clipped, breathless. "Elijah, the FBI just called me. You need to leave the house." "What happened?" he asked. "There's a device," she said. "They found something behind the community center, right where you're scheduled to speak this weekend." Elijah froze. His heart didn't race. It sank. The River Park Community Center had always been a refuge. Before it had a plaque. Before it was a building. It was the idea of safety, of roots. A place where black elders passed down stories in the kitchen. Where youth debated politics in the hallway. Where voices found each other when the city wouldn't listen. And now, beneath that very building, explosives. The device had been crudely made, but strategically placed. Wired with intention. It hadn't detonated, but it was real. Designed for maximum impact. Not just on people, on memory. On message. FBI agents sealed the block within the hour. The press didn't get wind of it until dawn. By then the building had been evacuated, the bomb defused, the area swept, but the damage had already rippled. Because someone hadn't just tried to kill a man, they tried to erase a movement. Elijah stood at the edge of the yellow tape the next morning, the wind cold on his face. He didn't speak, didn't react when officials offered condolences, didn't flinch when reporters shouted questions. He just stared at the community center, at the cracked sidewalk, at the police dogs sniffing for residue, and then he looked up slowly, at the sky above, as if daring the storm to try again. The morning after the bomb was found, the city felt like it had exhaled through gritted teeth. News vans camped outside the police line, desperate for a statement. Talk shows speculated without evidence. Rumors ballooned like wildfire, some calling the act domestic terror, others labeling it a false flag. Inside Elijah's home, the curtains remained drawn, the lights dim, the television off. But the pressure was deafening. Amira stood in the kitchen, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. "He's not stepping down," she said sharply into the receiver. "So stop asking." She listened, then added, "If you're so concerned about optics, maybe you should have protected him before explosives showed up." She hung up without waiting for a reply. Elijah sat at the table staring at a cold cup of coffee. He hadn't touched it. His hands were still stained with the smell of gunpowder and concrete dust from the crime scene. Not literally, but the scent lingered in his mind, burned into memory. "They want you to disappear again," Amira said, softer now. "They always do," Elijah replied. "But this time, it's wrapped in care. They'll say it's for your safety, not for their convenience. That's the new tactic." He said nothing, because he knew she was right. Darnell had called the night before. So had Maya. So had 2 FBI agents, all urging the same thing. "Step back, Elijah. At least temporarily, just until we assess the threat." They didn't say don't lead the commission. They said wait, breathe, be careful. But underneath it all, Elijah heard the truth. Be quiet. Again. That night he sat alone in the study. Rain tapped gently against the window. A worn book lay open beside him, dog-eared spine cracked, corners stained from years of being carried across deployments, classrooms, precincts. "Where do we go from here? Chaos or community?" By Martin Luther King Jr. He read the same line 3 times. "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." He closed the book, leaned back, and let the silence come. Images flooded his mind. Fred Hampton, shot in his sleep before he could finish the sentence that would have changed the movement. Medgar Evers, assassinated in his driveway while the milk from the grocery bag turned warm in his car. Martin, standing on a balcony, looking down moments before the bullet rose up. They were all men of truth. Not rage. But the truth was dangerous. He wondered if that's what made him flinch lately. Not fear of dying, but fear of dying incomplete. And then, without warning, his eyes welled. Tears slid down the side of his face before he could stop them. Not from sadness, from exhaustion. "I'm tired," he whispered. "So damn tired." And then he did something he hadn't done in years. He reached for a piece of paper. Elijah wrote slowly, deliberately. He didn't write to a network, or a commission, or a council. He wrote to his grandson, a boy too young to understand legacy, but one day, old enough to ask. The letter was handwritten, in cursive that looped like riverbanks, and trembled slightly at the edges. "To Melly, if you're reading this, I've either done something brave or something that scared the hell out of people. Maybe both. I want to tell you who I am. Not the version they put on TV, but the man I see in the mirror. I was never trying to be a hero. Heroes wear capes. I wore silence. I wore disappointment. I wore a badge for a while, and for too long I thought it meant something it didn't. They didn't just erase my name from reports. They erased me from birthdays, from anniversaries, from dinner tables. I let them. I told myself I was doing it to protect you, to protect your mom, to make a difference. But I realize now, I was trying to win a game that was rigged before I stepped onto the field. You should know, I made mistakes. I stayed quiet when I should have roared. I let your mother walk away thinking I loved the fight more than I loved her. That will always be my heaviest truth. But Malik, what I didn't do is quit. And what they couldn't do is kill the part of me that believes tomorrow is worth fighting for. If I'm gone when you read this, know that I went standing up. Not just for me, for you. Love, Grandpa Elijah. When he finished, the ink had dried in jagged streaks where his hands had trembled. He folded the letter gently, placed it in an envelope, and wrote for Malik in the top right corner. Then he tucked it into a drawer, beneath an old photo of his wife, her smile still sharp after all these years. But fate, as always, has a way of forcing the hand. The next morning, Amira came downstairs holding her phone, face pale. "Elijah." He looked up. "It's online." "What is?" She turned the screen to him. It was the letter. Word for word. Posted on an anonymous blog titled The Real Carter Manifesto. Thousands of views. Dozens of shares. News anchors already citing it. He took the phone slowly. His chest tightened, not from shame, but from exposure. "That letter wasn't supposed to be public," he said softly. "I didn't post it," she replied quickly. "I know." He stared at the screen as the words "his most private truth" flashed in the public square. And then, below the text, he saw the twist. If they won't let Elijah speak in person, then his words will carry the fire. Anonymous signature Project Lantern. Amira gasped. "That's not the hate group." "No," Elijah said. "It's something else. A counterforce. A rogue movement. An ally in the shadows." He didn't know who leaked it, or how, but it didn't matter. The words were no longer just his. They were everyone. Years passed, but the name Elijah Carter never faded. It echoed, not through slogans or statues, but in the quiet spaces where real change takes root. In classrooms, in board meetings, in whispered debates between cadets behind closed academy doors. River Park was no longer the city it had once been, and yet it still bore the scars. The story of Elijah's confrontation in Willow Creek Park had become curriculum, not legend. Every recruit at the reformed River Park Police Training Center now began their education with a case study titled The Carter Standard: Ethics, Silence, and Accountability. The center itself had moved across town into a new facility, one designed from the ground up with community oversight, de-escalation labs, and psychological resilience training. And just inside the main entrance, next to the mission statement etched in glass, hung a single black and white photo. Elijah Carter, 1987, arms folded, eyes steady, standing beside a whiteboard filled with diagrams and acronyms that had once saved lives and later nearly cost him his own. He never posed for that picture, but someone had captured him mid-instruction. Animated, committed, present. Below the image, a plaque read simply, "He trained them anyway." At a university 2 states away, Professor Lena Abrams adjusted her projector as a group of criminal justice students filed into their seats. "Today," she began, "we study not the martyr, but the architect, because Elijah Carter didn't die for his cause. He lived it, quietly, relentlessly, and without asking your permission." Slides clicked through one after another. Diagrams of policy chains, redacted memos from decades past, snapshots of tactical training rooms, scanned letters written by a younger Carter during his early deployments. She clicked to a quote, "Justice doesn't announce itself. It knocks once and waits. And when no one answers, it sits quietly outside, until someone dares to open the door." A student raised his hand. "Did Carter ever accept a public award?" Professor Abrams smiled faintly. "He accepted something better." "What's that?" She paused. "History's correction." In downtown River Park, the Elijah Carter Civil Rights Fellowship had entered its 5th year. Each recipient selected from hundreds of applicants received a full scholarship to study law, social work, or public policy. The only requirement? A personal essay on the phrase "unwritten legacy." One applicant's story stood out that year. A boy named Malik. His essay read in part, "My grandfather was never loud, but his absence was. Every time I walked into a space where no one looked like me, I understood what silence costs. He gave me permission to break it." Malik was 26 now, a full-fledged civil rights attorney, stationed in D.C., known for taking cases no one else would touch. Not for the spotlight, but for the precedent. He wore a plain watch Elijah had once owned, and kept a folded copy of his grandfather's handwritten letter in the inside pocket of every suit jacket. The last paragraph had become his daily reminder. "If I'm gone when you read this, know that I went standing up. Not just for me, for you." At Carter Freedom Park, the city's pulse beat quieter now. The benches were replaced, the playground expanded, and a new walking trail marked the same path Elijah once followed. Children played under the trees where he was once stopped. Teenagers read books under the same pavilion that had once been a site of whispers and warning. Every year, on the anniversary of the confrontation, no one made a speech. They simply gathered. Not in protest, in present. A living act of memory. No fireworks. No stage. Just a circle of community members reading excerpts from Elijah's writings. And a moment of silence at exactly 10:12 a.m., the time his name had been called out, barked as a command, only to echo back decades later, as a symbol of resistance. One spring afternoon, Amira walked the trail alone, holding a bouquet of tulips. She placed them near the dedication stone beneath the oldest tree in the park. She didn't stay long. She never did, but she lingered long enough to overhear a mother pointing toward the bench and telling her daughter, "That's where the city woke up." And for the first time in years, Amira smiled. Back inside the now expanded River Park Training Center, Officer Blake Harrison, now Lieutenant Harrison, stood before a new class of cadets. He didn't carry the same arrogance as before. The uniform no longer draped over entitlement. It hung with responsibility. Carter wasn't trying to make us feel bad, he said to the room. He wanted us to know better. And if you're sitting here today, thinking this badge is protection instead of accountability, you're in the wrong damn profession. No one laughed. No one flinched. They just listened, because now they understood. The man Blake once challenged was the man who'd taught him the most important lesson of all. Power means nothing if it doesn't answer to the people. In his final years, Elijah stayed mostly quiet. He declined interviews, turned down television features. Instead, he mentored. Privately, patiently, he answered every letter from students who reached out to him. He met with activists who didn't want validation, but direction. He told stories not about pain, but resilience. And when asked once what he would have changed if given the chance, he simply said, "I'd have listened to my daughter sooner." Amira sat beside him that day. She didn't cry. She just took his hand and whispered, "You did." On the last day of his life, Elijah walked the same trail he always had. Slow, deliberate, present. He passed a couple on a bench, reading the very article that had once leaked his private letter. He nodded. They smiled back. He passed a group of high schoolers drawing murals on the back wall of the community center, his name scrawled beneath a quote in bold paint. He stood when no one else did, and as the sun dipped low, he sat quietly on the same bench where it had all changed. Not to be remembered, just to remember. When the news of his passing broke, there was no state funeral, no spectacle, just people. Thousands lining the trail in silent vigil. And when Malik stood to deliver his eulogy, he didn't quote scripture or law. He just opened the letter, read it again, and closed with 4 words. He never stopped walking. Today the park remains open. Carter Freedom Park. But the final scene doesn't belong to Elijah. It belongs to the ones who came after. On a cloudy afternoon, years after the renaming, the park appears quiet. The camera pans slowly across the familiar path. Benches, trees, the stone plaque, empty, still. But then, in the distance, the soft crunch of gravel, a footstep, then another, steady, slow, deliberate, the sound of history, beginning again. If Elijah Carter's story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something deeper about justice, legacy, and silence turned into power, then don't let this moment end here. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge, uplift, and expose the truths often left untold. Like this video, if it stirred something in you. And most importantly, share it, because someone out there still believes they're invisible, and maybe this story reminds them they're not. We're building something here, story by story, truth by truth. Be part of that journey. The city hadn't seen a crowd this large in years. It began as a quiet event, an official press release, a ceremonial gathering. The mayor's office had billed it as a commemorative renaming of Willow Creek Park, in recognition of Elijah Carter's enduring legacy. But what arrived wasn't just ceremony. It was a movement. By noon, the park was packed shoulder to shoulder. Students in uniforms, elders with folding chairs, teachers with cardboard signs reading, "He taught us without speaking." There were nurses, postal workers, firemen, activists, and even former cadets, all threading their way through the grass. They came not because they were told to. They came because they couldn't stay away. The same trees that had cast shadows on Elijah during his daily walks now watched over a city waking up to its own history. What was once a place of quiet injustice had become a ground of communal reckoning. A stage stood at the center of the park, modest in build, draped in muted banners. No red carpets, no bright lights, just words projected above the platform. Renaming ceremony, Carter Freedom Park. At the edge of the crowd stood Officer Blake Harrison. Plain clothes, no badge, hands tucked into his pockets. He hadn't spoken publicly since the video of him confronting Elijah went viral. He didn't come to reclaim anything. He came to listen. He shifted from foot to foot, heart pounding in his chest. All around him, people stared past him, not with hostility, but with quiet recognition. Some still remembered him from the clip. Some had forgotten his face, but not the moment. Blake didn't expect redemption. He only hoped to learn something. A woman with a cane leaned beside him. "He trained you too?" she asked gently. Blake glanced at her. "In a way I didn't deserve." She nodded. "None of us did." But he gave it anyway. On stage, Maya Coleman stepped forward to speak. Her voice cracked only once. "Elijah Carter taught me that silence is a strategy only if it leads to clarity, not comfort," she began. "He didn't ask to be a symbol. He didn't campaign for recognition. He stood, and when the world moved to erase him, he didn't shout, he waited." She paused, scanning the crowd. And when the city finally looked up, he was still standing there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be believed. Applause surged, not out of celebration, out of understanding. When it faded, another speaker took the mic. An elderly man, with silver hair and a gentle limp. He introduced himself as a former officer. "Elijah Carter trained me in '88. I didn't speak his name for 2 decades, because I was afraid it would cost me my pension. But the truth doesn't expire." Gasps broke through the crowd. He continued, voice trembling. "This man didn't just save lives, he redefined them." Testimony after testimony followed. From a mother whose son had once been on the verge of expulsion, until Elijah wrote a letter that got him a scholarship. From a teacher who had used Elijah's words to teach conflict resolution. From a pastor who said Elijah's quiet endurance had reshaped the way he led his congregation.
They all shared different versions of the same story.
"He helped me without asking for credit. He stood when others sat. He didn't need to be loud to be heard." Backstage, Amira waited, hands folded. She'd been asked to speak last, a closing voice. But the chair beside her remained empty. Elijah wasn't coming. He had made that clear that morning. "I'm not attending my own memorial," he said with a wry smile. "Not while I'm still breathing." She didn't fight him. She understood. This park was no longer about his body in a space. It was about what his name meant in the mouths of others. "I don't want them to cheer," Elijah had told her. "I want them to remember, not what I did, what they ignored." At precisely 1:00 p.m., Mayor Hill took the stage. Flanked by city council members, he looked out at the mass of faces and tried to summon gravity. "Today we do not erase the past," he began. "We reckon with it. We reclaim it. We rename it." He turned to the curtain beside him. "In unanimous vote and by the power vested in this city, Willow Creek Park shall henceforth be known as." He gestured. The curtain dropped. "Carter Freedom Park." The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others wept. Some simply bowed their heads. And then in a gesture no one expected, the mayor stepped aside and knelt, one knee to the ground, silent, intentional. Within seconds, the first rows followed, then the next, until the park, thousands strong, knelt in solemn unity. Not protest, recognition. A collective breath, exhaled at last. From a rooftop 2 blocks away, Elijah watched it unfold on a muted live stream, broadcast through a local journalist's feed. He stood by an open window, wind brushing past his face. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just stood, as still as he had in the park all those years. Beside him, a small photo of Malik sat on the sill. Elijah touched it gently. "This ain't the end," he whispered. "This is the handover." Back at the ceremony, Amira finally stepped onto the stage. She looked out at the kneeling crowd and let the silence fill her chest.
Then she lifted the mic.
"My father chose not to come today. Not because he doesn't care, but because he knows this moment isn't his." She scanned the crowd. "It's yours." She gestured to the renamed banner. "That sign doesn't fix what happened. It doesn't restore what was taken. But it gives us a direction, a place to return to, a name to defend." A pause. "And if my father taught me anything, it's that names matter, because history doesn't forget what's carved into stone." She stepped back. But before she could leave the stage, a small voice called out from the crowd. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. A young girl no more than 10 stood at the front, holding her mother's hand tightly. She had braided hair, a worn backpack, and eyes wide with trembling purpose. The mic was offered to her. She stepped up shyly, barely tall enough to reach, but her voice carried. Elijah Carter saved my father's life. The crowd stilled. She continued. He was going to get arrested for something he didn't do. A long time ago, and Mr. Carter spoke up for him. Told the police they were wrong. No one else said anything. But he did, and my daddy came home. She paused. He told me to be brave like Mr. Carter. A tear slid down her cheek. I just wanted to say thank you. The crowd stood again, not clapping, just standing, as if rising in witness, as if to say, we heard you. And just as the girl stepped back into her mother's arms, a man in the back row turned toward his friend, whispered something sharp. The friend's eyes widened, because what he said wasn't awe, it was warning. There's a second Carter,